Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the Libertarian Communist Cast. This is a podcast for advancing a libertarian communist analysis of the world. Um, Today's episode will be the first in a series that we're going to be doing. Um, Critically analyzing Noam Chomsky's On Anarchism, which is a collection of his essays. Um, we're going to be starting out by taking a look at um, the introduction written by Nathan Schneider. Um, and before we get into that, I'll just introduce the both of us here. My name's Piper. I'm a trans woman. I write about politics and social science. I have a blog called Anti-Systemic on Blogspot, and I have a channel that's just my name, Piper Tompkins, on YouTube. With me is Ben. You want to introduce yourself, Ben?
Hello, my name is Ben. I don't have too much to say about myself right now. I mean, I'm just a person, an anarchist. I'm one of Piper's friends. I might have some plans for starting a channel and doing some content in the future, but I mean, as of right now, this was just an idea I had for a while. I was going to do a originally I was going to do an article just talking about Chomsky's anarchism and taking a critical, analysis of it more generally. But I never got around to that, and then time passed on, and I figured it might actually just be more of an interesting idea to break the book down chapter by chapter and see if we can get any good stuff out of that.
Yeah. So the way we want to deal with the introduction is we're going to kind of read it out in full for you all and give kind of commentary on it. We decided to do that because it's relatively short. For the other chapters or sections, we're not necessarily going to be doing that because they're longer, but this one's short enough that we figured we can.
Yeah, it's only about 4 pages.
Yeah. So, which one of us should do the honors of reading it?
I think I'll probably handle it.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So the introduction is written by Nathan Schneider, as Piper already said. Nathan Schneider currently is a professor of media studies, I think, at the University of Boulder, Colorado. At the time he wrote this, I don't know if he was a professor. I think he started as of like 2015. He was mostly known, and I think is still mostly known, for covering the Occupy Wall Street movement. And in general, he's mostly just involved in organizing workplace and community cooperatives online. So to give you an idea, that's kind of where he's coming at this from. All right. So this is going to be the introduction of On Anarchism. The essay or the introduction is called Anarcho-Curious or Anarchist Amnesia. All right. The first evening of a Solidarity bus tour in the West Bank, I listened as a contingent of college students from around the United States made an excellent discovery. They were all, at least kind of, anarchists. As they sat on stuffed chairs in the lobby of a lonely hotel near the refugee camp in war-ravaged Jenin, they probed one another's political tendencies, which were reflected in their ways of dressing and their most recent tattoos. All of this, along with the stories of past trauma, made their way out into the light over the course of our 10-day trip. I think I would call myself an anarchist, one admitted. Then another jumped into the space this created. Yeah, totally. Basic agreement about various ideologies and idioms ensued. Ableism, gender queerness, Zapatistas, black blocs, borders. The students took their near unison as an almost incalculable coincidence, though it was no such thing. This was the fall of 2012, just after the 1-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. A new generation of radicals had experienced a moment in the limelight and a sense of possibility, and had little clear idea about what to do next. They had participated in an uprising that aspired to organize horizontally, that refused to address its demands to the proper authority, and that, like other concurrent movements around the world, prided itself on the absence of particular leaders. One couldn't call the Occupy movement an anarchist phenomenon per se, though some of its originators were self-conscious and articulate anarchists. Most who took part wouldn't describe their objectives that way. Still, the motive being that Occupy swept so many people into with its temporary autonomous zones and public squares nevertheless left them feeling, as it was sometimes said, anarcho-curious.
So
the generation... Oh yeah, go ahead.
Since he's done with the anecdote, I just want to make the quick point that I fucking hate when writers start out with goddamn anecdotes. Like, it's the most boring, dry bullshit ever. Like, they think they're making it more entertaining by starting out with an anecdote, but they're not. Like, I'm here to read about the subject. I don't give a shit that, like, you had some experience that's kind of related to it. Just get to the goddamn point.
I mean, yeah, I'm not gonna lie. Like, there's something about the introduction that just, it like, I mean, I just feel like I'm feeling like I'm reading this like from an anarcho tourist, you know? It's like, I don't know. The intro just always gives me bad vibes, like when it starts off. The generation most activated by Occupy is one for which the Cold War means everything and nothing. We came to consciousness in a world where communism was a doomed proposition from the get-go, vanquished by our Reagan-esque grandfathers and manifestly genocidal to boot. Capitalism won fair and square. Market forces work.
Okay. So everyone should be aware that what they just heard is part of an introduction to a collection of essays by Noam Chomsky dealing with anarchism. So this guy, when introducing Chomsky's essays about anarchism, basically makes the argument that the Cold War proved that capitalism was the best thing ever.
Yeah. Like, originally when I read this, I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt and just assume that, you know, he was like, just setting up like the kind of political context that his generation was in. But considering he's like really into cooperatives and, you know, just the way he talks about this further on, it kind of becomes apparent that he most likely just, he doesn't care too much for, like, you know, communism.
The other thing is that, like, so it'd be one thing if he said, after the fall of the Soviet Union, neoliberal capitalism became dominant, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that I would agree with that analysis, but, like, you know, that's an analysis that's widely shared among the left.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't necessarily wince at that. But he's saying kind of just plainly that capitalism proved itself superior as a result of the Cold War.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. A vaguer kind of socialism, such as what furnished the functional train systems that carried us on backpacking trips across Europe, still held some appeal. I'm just going to say right now that, tied into the intro, that's another line that I find particularly painful. You know, it just paints a very bad picture for me. It kind of poisons the well, you know.
Yeah, you get a picture of him as a gentrifying crust punk.
Yeah, kind of. Yet the word socialism has been so thoroughly tarnished in the hegemonic sound bites of Fox News as to be obviously unusable politically. It's also the word Fox associates with Barack Obama, whom this generation's door-knocking helped elect, but whose administration strengthened the corporate oligarchy, waged unaccountable robot wars, and imprisoned migrant workers and heroic whistleblowers at record rates. So much for socialism. Anarchism, then, is a corner backed into rather than a conscious choice, and a apophatic last resort, and a fruitful one. It permits being political outside the red and blue confines of what is normally referred to as politics in the United States, without being doomed to a major party's inevitable betrayal. We can affirm the values we've learned on the internet: transparency, crowdsourcing, freedom to, freedom from. We can be ourselves. Anarchy is the political blank slate of the early 21st century. It is shorthand for an eternal now, for a chance to restart the clock. Nowhere is this more evident than in the anarchic online collective Anonymous, whose only qualification for membership is having effaced one's identity, history, origins, and responsibility. This anarchist amnesia that has overtaken radical politics in the United States is a reflection of the amnesia in U.S. politics generally. With the exception of a few shared mythologies about our founding slaveholders and our most murderous wars, we like to imagine that everything we do is being done for the very first time. Such amnesia can be useful because it lends a sensation of pioneering vitality to our undertakings that the rest of the history-heavy world seems to envy, but it also condemns us to forever reinvent the wheel. And this means missing out on what makes anarchism worth taking seriously in the end: the prospect of learning over the course of generations how to build a well-organized and free society from the ground up.
I never like made hide nor tails of what he was trying to say with amnesia. Like, I never understood what he was like, what the amnesia is supposed to be. Like, it seems just to me to be kind of this broad generalization that he doesn't really explain.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a general problem with the introduction. There's a lot of points that he doesn't really elaborate on. And I mean, even though introductions are generally supposed to be short, he really could do with a lot of elaborations on certain things. Like, you'll see later, in about the next paragraph, he starts going into a bunch of historical examples that he basically just bullet points off and doesn't really try and explain why he brought those up to,
From a writing standpoint, you can even get away with like a long preface, which this is more of a preface, I guess, than an introduction. But
yeah,
but you can get away with a really long preface if you say something that's like poignant.
Yeah. Okay. Our capacity to forget is astonishing. In 1999, a horizontal spokes council organized the protest that helped shut down the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle. Just over a decade later, a critical mass of Occupy Wall Street participants considered such a decision-making structure an illegitimate and intolerably reformist innovation. Despite whatever extent to which we have ourselves to blame for our amnesia, however, it also has been imposed on us through repression against the threat anarchism was once perceived to pose. Remember that an anarchist president was killed by an American president was killed by an anarchist, and another anarchist assassination set off World War I. I'm not too sure about that. I thought it was really just Albanian nationalism, but I mean, that's besides the point. There are still unmarked gashes on buildings along Wall Street left over from anarchist bombs. More usually and more dangerously, anarchists used to travel across the country teaching industrial workers how to organize themselves and demand a fair share from their robber baron bosses. Thus, the official questionnaire at Ellis Island sought to single out anarchists coming from Europe. Thus, Italian anarchists Sacco and Vanzetti were martyred in 1927, and roving grand juries imprison anarchists without charge today. Thus, we see liberal sleights of hand, such as the one described in Chapter 3, by which the anarchist popular revolution underway during the Spanish Civil War was deftly erased from history. Anarchism's slate is really anything but blank. In this book, Noam Chomsky plays the role of an ambassador for the kind of anarchism that we're supposed to have forgotten, that has a history and knows it, that has already shown another kind of world to be possible. He first encountered anarchism as a child in New York before World War II, succeeded in making capitalist against communist Machianism the unquestioned civil religion of the United States. He could find not just Marx but also Bakunin in the bookstalls. He witnessed a capitalist class save itself from the Depression-era ruin only by creating a social safety net and tolerating unions. The Zionism he was exposed to was a call to agrarian collectivism, not to military occupation. I mean, that kind of goes hand in hand. The principle with Chomsky describes his own anarchist leanings with which Chomsky describes his own anarchist leanings, draws a common thread from early modern libertarian theorists like Godwin and Proudhon to the assassinations of the early 1900s and the instincts of anonymous today. Power that isn't really justified by the will of the governed should be dismantled. More to the point, it should be refashioned from below, without greedy elites maintaining their privilege and propaganda with propaganda and force. Workers might own and govern their workplaces, and communities might provide for the basic needs of everyone. Not all anarchist tactics are equally ethical or effective, but they do more or less arise from this common hope. Into old age, Chomsky carries his anarchism with uncommon humaneness, without the need to put it on display as a black mask caricature of itself. A lifetime of radical ideas and busy activism is enough of a credential. He sees no contradiction between holding anarchist ideals and pursuing certain reforms to the state when there's a chance for a more free, more just society in the short term. Such humility is a necessary antidote to the self-defeating purism of many anarchists today. Although I would also argue that so far this essay kind of suffers from, anything that opposes authority is anarchist. There's really kind of an ongoing, scattershot thing where okay, well, this is anarchist, that is anarchist.
Yeah. There's also the fact that he's describing Chomsky's proclivity toward the Democratic Party as some kind of noble, level-headed, position, and that's just kind of,
I mean, it's weird too because it's it's just he casts such a wide net that what can you, it's what are you supposed to get out of it? On one hand, he's applauding the assassinations of President McKinley, I guess Franz Ferdinand, if that was done by an anarchist, bombings of Wall Street, and then on the other hand he's like, but it's just kind of weird to me.
I don't know if he was applauding that, but yeah, it does. I don't know. His politics are. He never really makes explicit his politics in this essay, but yeah, it's just funny to me that he describes Chomsky's proclivity towards uncritical reliance on the Democratic Party as this kind of, oh well, I will fight for reforms even if they are provided by the state.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, he represents a time when anarchists were truly fearsome, less because they were willing to put a brick through a Starbucks window than because they had figured out how to organize themselves in a functional, egalitarian, and sufficiently productive society. This side of anarchism was the cause of George Orwell's revelry upon arriving in Barcelona to join the war against Franco. It's a moment he records in Homage to Catalonia, a book you'll find quoted several times in the pages that follow. Already farms, factories, utilities, and militias were being run by workers along anarcho-socialist lines. Orwell recalls, I had dropped more or less by chance into the only community of any size in Western Europe where political consciousness and disbelief in capitalism were more normal than their opposites. Up here in Aragon, one was among tens of thousands of people, mainly, though not entirely, of working class origin, all living at the same level and mingling on terms of equality. In theory, it was perfect equality, and even in practice, it was not far from it. There is a sense in which it would be true to say that one was experiencing a foretaste of socialism, by which I mean that the prevailing mental atmosphere was that of socialism. Many of the normal motives of civilized life, snobbishness, money grubbing, fear of the boss, etc., had simply ceased to exist. The ordinary class division of society had disappeared to an extent that is almost unthinkable in the money-tainted air of England. There was no one there except the peasants and ourselves, and no one owned anyone else as his master. Of course, such a state of affairs could not last. It was simply a temporary and local phase in an enormous game that is being played out over the surface of the earth. but it has lasted long enough to have its effects upon anyone who experienced it. However much one cursed at the time, one realized afterwards that one had been in contact with something strange and valuable. One had been in a community where hope was more normal than apathy or cynicism, where the word comrade stood for comradeship and not, as in most countries, for humbug. One had breathed the air of equality. With a few proper nouns adjusted, much the same statement could have come from a witness to the Occupy movement, though the awe would be less well-deserved. Orwell saw anarchy overtake a whole city along with large swaths of countryside, rather than the square block or less of a typical Occupy encampment. That these far smaller utopias managed to convey the same sense of knock-you-down newness of soul-conquering significance is probably because of the historical amnesia again. Most people had never learned about the bigger ones in school. They were astonished by the systemic violence used to eliminate the Occupy encampments because they hadn't heard about how the Spanish anarchists in the Paris Commune were crushed with military force as well. Amnesia constrains ambition and inoculates against patience. Still, developments are underway that contribute to anarchism's legacy. Anarchists in this country now insist on grappling with challenges of sexual identity and ingrained oppression that mainstream society gingerly prefers not to recognize. They are at the forefront of movements to protect animal rights and the environment that future generations will be grateful for. As industrial agriculture becomes more and more poisoned by profit motives, anarchists are growing their own food. Anarchist hackers understand better than most of us the power of information and the lengths that those in power will go to control it. Proof is in the years and decades-long prison sentences now being doled out for online civil disobedience. These mighty insights, along with so much else, risk being lost to amnesia if they're not passed on in memory and habit, if they're not treated as part of a legacy rather than as just passing reactions against the latest brand of crisis. At least in their various collectives and affinity groups, committed anarchists today tend to be a literate bunch who do know their history, even if others have forgotten. A bit of historical consciousness suggests something else. There may be more anarcho-curiosity among us than we tend to realize. Among the supporting characters one finds in Peter Marshall's Chomsky-endorsed study, Demanding the Impossible, A History of Anarchism, are forefathers to those we call libertarians in the United States, which is to say capitalists in favor of minimal government, including John Stuart Mill, William von Humboldt, and Herbert Spencer. Chomsky refers to the right-wing libertarianism as an aberration nearly unique to this country, a theory of a world built on hatred that would self-destruct in 3 seconds. Yet the vitality of this once-or-twice removed cousin of anarchism becomes evident with every election cycle when libertarian candidate Ron Paul squeezes his way into the Republican debates, thanks to the impressively determined and youthful army fighting for his revolution, the capitalized words love spelled backwards. This is anarchism with corporate funding and misplaced nostalgia. It's solidarity cleaved off by the willful protagonists in Ayn Rand's novels. Yet I'm more optimistic than I'm often told I should be about the prospects for and longings of this bloc and of the chances for reuniting it with a libertarianism more worth having. In the early days and weeks of Occupy Wall Street, libertarian foot soldiers were out in force. They too had a bone to pick with a government/empire that acts like a subsidiary of the big banks, and they kept trying to draw occupiers into their sieges of the Federal Reserve Building, a block from occupied Zuccotti Park. A block away from occupied Zuccotti Park. But over time, they withdrew from the encampments, probably after having had enough of the disorderliness and the leftist identity politics. They retreated to tabling stations a block or two away, and then disappeared from the movement just about entirely. The scenario could have played out differently. If it had, what might these right and left libertarians, equally amnesiac about their common origins, learn from one another? The anarcho-curious left might rediscover that there is more to a functional resistance movement than youthful rebellion. Its members might, for instance, study working examples of the mutual aid they long for, education, material support, free daycare, in churches and megachurches across the country, which form both the social and power base of the right. Independent of the state, these citadels put into practice something anarchists have been saying all along. No form of politics is worth our time until it helps struggling people get what they need, sustainably and reliably. All the better if you can do so without patriarchy and fundamentalism. Meanwhile, the libertarian right might find the wherewithal to detach from its overly rosy view of the Constitution, from its more or less subtle racism against non-whites and immigrants, and its 1%er sponsors. It might raise tougher questions about whether competition is really the most liberating response to long-standing injustices along lines of gender, race, and circumstance. What would these young, energetic libertarians think if they encountered an egalitarian democratic anarchism in the form of a robust political philosophy and practice? For too many people, Ayn Rand is as close as they're ever exposed to, and she's not very close at all. Anarchism deserves better than to be a mere curiosity or a blank slate, or an overlapping consensus among newly minted radicals who have trouble agreeing on anything else. It is better than that. Both the anarcho-curiosity awakened by Occupy and the flourishing of right-wing libertarians are signs that anarchism is overdue for recognition as a serious intellectual tradition and a real possibility. Noam Chomsky has been treating it that way throughout his career, and more of us should follow suit. All right, that's the end of the essay.
Yeah. So, my big criticism of this introduction is that although he tries to say that anarchism should be more than a blank slate, he doesn't really offer anything more than a blank slate to
exactly
with. So, the first interesting thing is that he never actually sets out a summary definition of anarchist ideas. Like, he never says anarchists want this, or anarchists want that, or anarchism is about this. He just says, well, these are things anarchists do.
Yeah.
And at that point, the label anarchist becomes more confusing than it is clarifying.
Yeah, I think, at that one point, he basically, tries to, argue that, classical liberalism, and then, even though Chomsky might not think it, he does kind of say that classical liberalism, and by extension, right-wing libertarianism are actually, very much have a common, groundwork and aims as anarchism, which is, it's kind of jarring, the fact that you would think that.
Yeah, so because anarchism to Schneider is this formless opposition to power, then things like right-wing libertarianism, which just want to exchange state power for capitalist power, which is a nonsense dichotomy anyway, become part of the anarchist tradition in some way. And he sees some path towards reconciling anarchism with American right-wing libertarianism, whereas even Chomsky is firmly convinced otherwise. So it's basically just a failure to properly define what anarchism is. If you're going to be using this label anarchism, it must stand for something. Otherwise, there's no point in calling things anarchism or anarchist. And there must be some criteria for what anarchism is, or what makes something anarchist or a person anarchist. There must be some criteria. And he just doesn't deal with that at all.
Yeah. I mean, it becomes pretty clear because it's just like I said earlier, it's really just a lot of this is very scattershot. We've gone from starting off with a bus tour through Jenin, just, I don't know, which comes across to me as, people just witnessing this, and now I don't know too much about the background behind that event, but it doesn't appear to me, and from what he described, that the students there were very, involved or really helping that much in the struggle of Palestinian people against, Israeli occupation. They just seem to be touring in a bus and, observing this and then talking about their tattoos. So it starts off with that. And then we go to Occupy Wall Street, which, I mean, he admits that it wasn't overtly, anarchist. He said, he contends that the ability for people to, I don't know, have their autonomous zones was, part of what got people the unfortunate term anarcho-curious. He goes to that, and then he goes on to talk about Anonymous, which, I mean, that's kind of a dodgy example. I mean, hacker movements are always kind of, I don't know, weird to, explicitly define along ideological lines. But I mean, Anonymous, I mean, from what I recall, mostly just ended up kind of harassing celebrities later on. It's really hard to say how much they,
I mean, yeah,
really...
I haven't studied Anonymous, and I'm kind of interested to do so in the future. But like, I was kind of paying attention when they got big, and like, I'm not sure if they were even a coherent thing. Like, there were all kinds of fucking YouTube videos with people dressed up in fucking Guy Fawkes masks, ranting on about random things. There was the Million Mask March.
Yeah.
Which I'm not even sure what the point of that was. There was, a lot of them were talking about Edward Snowden type stuff, about the NSA and all of that, and the surveillance state. But then a lot of them were going on about how we need to I don't know, expose pedophiles or something. It was like a random hodgepodge of shit.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was just, I mean, from what I remember, it wasn't Anonymous mostly just involved in leaking celebrities' nudes too.
Yeah,
for whatever reason.
Very well could have been. I mean, that's the thing. I'm not sure if there was ever a defining cause of Anonymous. Again, I could be wrong. I'm not, I haven't studied the issue, but from what I remember of what I saw of it back then, it didn't seem like there's anything coherent to it.
I mean, that's the thing. I think you get that general impression though, from at least a lot of people I've talked to. They have very similar perspectives of Anonymous, and I feel I mean, maybe it's just part of when this essay was written, it was more in the early 2010s, I think. So it's going to have maybe the certain view they did of some of these movements around the time, but it would still pay, especially for the longevity of your essay, to actually back up why you're saying these things are anarchists instead of just bringing them up and kind of going along. To me, at a certain point, the essay feels like he's more just plugging in his opinions and his I don't know, as a journalist, his life's writing on stuff, than actually trying to direct this towards why he endorses the book and what these movements are going to stand for.
Right.
Other than once again, like you said, this kind of vague opposition to hierarchy.
Right. Yeah, I'm ultimately not sure why they got him to do this. To me, it seems like it would have been better, and there are a bunch of people that you can get for this. It would have been better to get someone. I mean, it might have been better to get someone like Peter Marshall or someone.
Yeah.
Or even better, someone like Robert Graham. Actually, scholars specifically study anarchism, not this dude who's who's just kind of this vague anti-establishment guy,
Yeah, no, I mean from I haven't done I know as a disclaimer, I'm not a Nathan Schneider scholar. I don't know. I don't pretend to know too much about all of his works, but from what I've seen out of him, I mean, most of what he really talks about is just organizing cooperatives and having a more progressive business model and collective forms of ownership, which, I mean, I mean, at that point, it's kind of weird. I would even imagine some of these movements he's actually, mentioning here would even be contradictory to like his, support for cooperatives, especially like say some of the anarchist labor movements of the past. But yeah, no, he just kind of jumps all around the place. And then the most egregious one though is at the end where it's like, so yeah, he's gone from like the Janine bus tour, Anonymous, Occupy Wall Street. What were the other ones? Ron Paul, the Revolution Love Spelt Backwards. That one got weird.
He also talked about the actual anarchist movement specific, which is weird. He mostly talked about the terroristic aspects of the anarchist movement.
Yeah.
It's really strange because that was a specific period of the anarchist movement and it wasn't a long lasting one. And there was a much wider history of the anarchist movement as a labor movement, and he doesn't really talk. He kind of mentions it, but he devotes much more time to talking about anarcho-terrorists than he does, talking about the actual labor movement.
Yeah, I mean that's just the thing. Like we've said a million times at this point, it would like really pay to like actually expound and like maybe defend some of these things you're saying, especially like because I mean just off of the history of like a lot of anarchist assassinations and what at the time was mostly known as propaganda by the deed. Typically, the conclusions a lot of people drew out of that in that time period was that it didn't really carry them to places it thought it would, and most of the times it was tried. I mean, it didn't really take them anywhere as far as really just more increased repression and like often distancing from like the working movements they were trying to support.
Yeah, I mean, propaganda of the deed anarchism basically just kind of alienated itself from the working masses, which is why it didn't last very long, and that's why it's the most prolific or shocking period in anarchist history, while also being one of the shortest and most irrelevant.
I mean, that's the thing too, though, right? Because it's like, if we are going to have this thing he says where like, because I find the general idea that he kind of tries to bring out around the end to be kind of agreeable. Like, I do think that, it's important to maintain like, a generational awareness of like, the history of where struggles have come from, where they're going, the tactics people have used. I mean, that's all good to be informed on that stuff. But it's like, at the same time, it's like, I mean, I guess getting back to like how I called like the intro, just like a weird feeling of anarcho-tourism. Like it's like there's like almost an aesthetic appreciation of these things, but very little of like trying to like have a more substantive kind of understanding and opinions and positions on them, because like.
Yeah, he doesn't take his own advice to go beyond the amnesia or the curiosity and have, and cultivate a more robust conception of anarchism. He kind of just reinforces the amnesia, if anything, whatever the amnesia is supposed to be.
Yeah, because I mean, like at this point, like it would have paid to like have just gone on for like it's not uncommon for like especially a lot of books that have like the classical anarchist period to have like at least 15-page intros where people go over like the basic definitions of how they view anarchism and like just a general discussion of like what their values are. Yeah, and that usually helps it quite a bit.
You get into like academic studies in whatever field of scholarship you want. You can get like introductions, especially that are like even like 100 pages long. So it wouldn't have killed him to elaborate a little bit more about about the things he was trying to convey.
Yeah, I mean, even Chomsky, I'm pretty sure did something like that with like, Chomsky's always been like a pretty big commentator on like the history of like just anarchism in general. He had like, I'm pretty sure he did an introduction to like, it was either he did one to like I think Anarcho-Syndicalism Theory and Practice by Rudolf Rocker, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he did.
And that one was fairly lengthy. Like,
yeah, I think it was like around 25 pages, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, I could check, but I don't feel like pulling the thing out. But
Yeah, no, we don't want the live stream to go on too long because I mean, I feel like there's not too much more to discuss because it's like he goes like I think the only thing I really see here too where he kind of gets into like maybe a bit more of like a position on like something you'd recommend for like what we need to learn from to build an anarchist movement. Like he says, it's weird because like he says at one part that like it kind of goes into a different point because then he also has this idea that like he says we need to be more than just a reaction to certain circumstances, but he also says that we need to understand some of the bases of power really quickly at the end. We need to understand the bases of power of like right-wing fundamentalism through mega churches and like I guess daycares or something, and like build like alternatives to that. I mean, that was probably the closest I really saw in the last few sentences there to anything that felt slightly constructive or an indication of the direction he felt things needed to go.
Yeah.
But then that's all just kind of like still in the middle of like this really weird need to justify right-wing libertarianism for some odd reason.
Yeah,
like Ron Paul as being a positive development in anarchist history. Like, I mean, especially like to alleviate anarcho-amnesia. In the future, people are, if this is what we base our opinions off of, we're going to have something like anarcho-confusion. like,
yeah. I mean, I think actually, now that you say that, I think actually stuff like this and like, because the kind of eclecticism of this essay is kind of a wider problem in anarchism, in the left, so-called, even now.
Yeah.
So, like this, like proclivity to, or this sympathy for the right-wing, right-wing libertarianism and Libertarian Party in the United States, in this essay is, it kind of directly brings to mind the fact that for whatever reason, a libertarian socialist caucus has been created in the Libertarian Party. So this kind of eclecticism of melding things that have no business being melded is still an ongoing problem. So the anarcho confusion may not be, a spooky horizon. It may be something that's unfortunately already here.
Yeah, it's kind of been an unfortunate reality, I feel, of like the last decade. I mean, I think this essay itself just kind of suffers from I guess if we're gonna try and coin that term, it kind of suffers from it. Like, I mean, just the whole thing. I mean, it feels like it was written by a Che Guevara T-shirt.
Yeah, right.
Like it's very weird. I'm gonna be interested to see actually later on in the book, like the rest of the book is written by Chomsky, so it's going to be interesting to see how this compares to the introduction, because I feel like just in general as an introduction, it's a letdown too, because it should at least give you an idea of like what the book is going to cover usually, or like an idea of what Chomsky wants to say, or at least an endorsement of it. But I don't think that most of the things he's talked about so far are really covered in the book. Just looking at the table of contents, I don't think he talks about Anonymous. I don't think he really talks about Occupy. He doesn't really talk about most of the things Schneider is talking about and not explaining. So there's a weird almost disconnect between the introduction and the rest of the book, I think, is going to kind of come out of this too.
Yeah, although something that kind of alarmed me when I was reading a little bit into the first essay was that Chomsky wasn't really departing from this idea of anarchism as a vague opposition to power.
Yeah.
So, that might be something that we run into as we read through this.
I mean, that much I'm definitely sure, because Chomsky's always had that long running definition of anarchism as like, the seeking out of unjustified hierarchies, and if it can't justify itself to the people, then you who are questioning it, then you dismantle it.
Right.
And the example, but then that means that through the process of seeking out justified and unjustified hierarchies, obviously the question is, okay, then what is a justified hierarchy? And that gets into weird ground, because it's like Chomsky's only the only example I ever remember him bringing up is like, if a child gets into traffic, you pull it out of the road, or
Right.
you pull the child out of the road. If a parent does it, then that's an instance of hierarchy, which is weird, because I wouldn't say it is. It's just, a parent, I would say that's actually maybe, I don't know, a horizontal action, whatever you want to call it. A one person helping another person survive isn't an act of like an exercise of power. I mean,
Yeah. I mean,
so,
yeah. Does he do that whole, like, does he do the unjustified hierarchy thing in the book?
I'm pretty sure it gets to that point. But we'll have to see, because it's been a few years since I've like actually read through a lot of the chapters. Like, the most I can remember is maybe chapter 2, and I don't think he talks about it there. It's chapter 2, I think, is mostly just like a selection of writings on like his experiences like early in life, like on the kibbutz, which is like a kind of an early like collectivist, or no, collective agrarian kind of communities in Israel.
Right. Yeah. So I think with that, we've been going for about 50 minutes. So yeah, thank you everyone for watching, and stay tuned for future episodes of the Libertarian Communist Cast. The next episode we'll be dealing with the first essay on anarchism. So yeah, look forward to that. See you guys later. Do you have anything more to say, Ben?
No, pretty much. I think we've more or less gone over really all there might be to say about this introduction. There should be a lot more worth talking about on chapter 1, which is Notes on Anarchism.
Right.
That'll be interesting to see, because it's going to be, Chomsky's own evaluation of what he considers to be, anarchism and anarchist movements, and he actually delves a bit more into like classical anarchists like Guerin and Rocker. So that'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, and Chomsky tends to, because of his significance, he tends to frustrate me in how he represents anarchism. So, you all will get to enjoy me being very angry, I'm sure.
Yeah, personally, as much as like, I don't think Chomsky might be like as bad and eclectic as like, Schneider's introduction has painted him as, in that part where he's like, Chomsky draws influence from like the unionist movements to the assassinations to Anonymous, which is kind of a weird, I don't think he has, but I don't recall Chomsky ever really saying he's heavily ideologically influenced by Anonymous, but
yeah, I've never even heard him talk about it.
Yeah, at least for me, like, I mean, if we're talking about potential pet peeves that are going to come up personally with me, I'm not too big on like what Schneider actually did get right was his affinity for classical liberalism. Especially like Milton Friedman and Adam Smith and people like that. Especially because it is similar to
Milton
how I feel.
Friedman wasn't a classical liberal. Friedman was.
Sorry, John Stuart Mill.
Yeah,
for some reason, sometimes I get those two people mixed up.
Friedman was the neoliberal, actually.
Yeah, he was a neoliberal. Yeah, no, that was just a slip up. Yeah, I meant to say John Stuart Mill. Yeah, I mean, those were people who, from my recollection, wrote justifications for slavery. And while we can say, that they weren't in favor of let's say an overreaching market system, they were still advocates for a technocratic state-centered solutions to most of these problems. So there's a lot of problematic, I guess, implications and Chomsky's affinity for that. At least that's how I feel.
But I'm sure we'll get to see that as this progresses.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean that's a good day to call it. A good time to call it.
Yeah. All right. See you all later. Thank you for watching and stay tuned.